everybody. If we can, everyone can grab a seat. We're going to get started. My name is Tom Dunn. I'm the Executive Director of the Southampton Arts Center. It's my great pleasure to welcome you on this gorgeous Saturday afternoon to this environmental forum. I want to thank you all for coming out. It's great to come out together and be together as a community and to talk about these really important topics. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about Southampton Arts Center. There's a fantastic exhibition on view through the early July called Earth Artists as Activism, Artists as Activists, excuse me. It's timely, beautiful, actionable, and I encourage you to come see it. I want to thank the sponsor of Earth, Douglas Elliman Real Estate. I also want to thank Dorothy and Michael Riley, who are the sponsors of our eco programming, and Dorothy's here with us, so let's give her a nice round of applause. Thank you. You're a great friend to SAC and a great friend to the environment, Dorothy. Thank you. I'd also love to point out to you that we're in the process of installing an outdoor sculpture garden called Whimsy, which is curated by Eric Fischel. We're proud to bring back the very famous or infamous Legs by Larry Rivers back to the on the other side of the lawn here. And that's it. So listen, we've got a great summer planned for you. I'm going to get right to the talk, and it's my pleasure to introduce Joe Shaw, the executive editor of the Southampton Press. Thank you all.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you to Tom and Daniela and Joe for inviting me to moderate this and giving me a reason to actually put on clothes. And I apologize for overdressing, but it's been a year, folks. I haven't been out in public, and I didn't want to just wear sweatpants. So I went a little overboard today, and I apologize for that. I also want to just say in advance, you're going to see my phone. It's because it's 2021, and I have notes on my phone. I'm not texting people and distracted or anything like that, I promise you. But I do have a list of the folks who are on the panel, and I want to make sure I get all of their names right. So we'll go left to right here. On the far left, of course, is Jesse Warren, who is the mayor of Southampton Village. Welcome, Jesse.
Thank you, Joe.
Next to him is Ann Welker, who is a Southampton Town trustee. Hi, Ann. All right, here we go. Dieter von Lehsten. On a scale of 1 to Jay Schneiderman butchering it, how did I do?
5.
All right, good. I'll take a 5. Dieter is the chair of the Southampton Town Sustainability Committee. Thanks, Dieter. And Dr. Chris Gobler, who is a professor at Stony Brook University. Thank you for joining us, Chris. So the purpose of the conversation today is about environmental policy. I think we can spend the entire 45 minutes or so talking about environmental needs, and certainly that's part of the conversation. But I really want to talk about policy and things that are happening and things that need to happen to address all of the problems that I think there's a real consensus about what the problems are. So let's start there. And Chris, I want to start with you. Talk about what you think some of the most significant things that we've achieved in the last year or two, just recently, going towards what we need to do to start addressing environmental concerns.
Sure. Well, I mean, there's a lot of good things to talk about. If we take the perspective that I often do, that we've had what I call a sea change in our local ecosystems in the last several decades, with the overloading of nitrogen into our groundwater, entering our surface waters, and that triggering a cascading of events, harmful algal blooms that then shade out our seagrass where our fish live, that also can poison our shellfish and kill them off. And as a consequence, we've lost 99% of our, say, scallops and hard clams. If you follow that chain all the way back to the source, the main source of that nitrogen that triggers all those things is on-site septic systems in Suffolk County. And that's really almost anywhere you go, except for areas that are very dense agriculture. And so, you know, if we were here 5 years ago, I might have said all these things and followed up with, and nobody's doing anything about it. But in the last 5 years, again, there's also been a sea change for the positive on the land, and that's been Suffolk County Department of Health really taking a lead and people being able, firstly, just being able to have septic systems that are modern and remove a lot of nitrogen before it goes into the groundwater.
Explain that. For the longest time, the county really wouldn't let people do that, right?
Yeah, I mean, there was the last change to the health code at the county level was in 1972, where they said, well, you can't have just a hole in the ground, you have to have a box that then goes to a hole in the ground. And then it wasn't until 2016 that they then allowed these new systems. And you know, I give all the credit to the county. You know, it took them, you could say it took them a while, but the way I like to put it is that they went from worst to first when it comes to on-site septic, because honestly, the program they have in place is the most aggressive for anywhere in the nation. I mean, if you look at the way they have it set up now, they released their sub-watersheds plan. That plan says there's 380,000 septic systems in Suffolk County. We will upgrade 220,000 of those by 2050. And they have it exactly planned out which ones, where, and the science behind why. And so that's at the county level. And then, of course, there's been all sorts of great things happening here in Southampton with regards to the Community Preservation Fund and the change in that law in 2018 that's set up the fund to allow people to apply for the funds to actually install these systems and get grant money to do so. And so that's been an incredible bonus. And if you look at the upgrades on a per capita basis in the towns that do that, Southampton and East Hampton, we're way ahead of the curve. In fact, we're matching some of the most populous towns.
That's reassuring. I mean, it's nice to hear that there's been some positive progress. And it continues. Dieter, there's on the agenda right now at the town board, there's a proposal that I think did it come from the Sustainability Committee regarding a ban on balloons? Can you talk about that? That's something that's, when we talk about policy and environmental policy, the plastic bag ban went into place a few years ago, and that was a bit of a heavy lift. How does this compare, trying to get balloons banned, and why is that important to the environment?
Now let me start by saying is that the Sustainability Committee looks for practical applications. We are a volunteer group advising the Southampton town government as to what to do when we see a problem somewhere, which comes from everyone around here or wherever we find it. The balloon situation is one where the release of balloons, festivities, we all have seen hundreds of them going up at football games and etc. They're all floating away happily, and we don't seem to see them anymore. We see them, we meet them again on the beach or at the killed animals, which are mistaking them for their food and eat them, digest them, and die. And it is another side effect which most people are not that much aware of, that quite a few of them, especially the Mylar balloons, they get hung up in the electric lines and create shortages. So there's been an increase of over 26% of outings in PSEG territory just on these Mylar balloons.
And it happened in the village only recently, and in the middle of summer, right?
And therefore, all the projects which we are taking on, the other one is, for instance, which all of you are, thank God, heavily involved, and we get you more involved, is get rid of these damped gas leaf blowers. Who hasn't suffered from that? They are all day long, and whether you need them really or not, it's a health hazard. It's from the noise, from the pollution, from the air, the particles which floating around. And don't forget, when they fill these units up, the spilling of the gasoline is enormous. So that is another big project we are working on. But, and I can say that with a cheek and tongue, we're in the election here right now, and anything which has any little bit of controversy anywhere, politicians hate to take it on. They might lose a voice or two, which they would have otherwise gotten if they didn't take it. So it's a little bit of that. So we are always looking for issues where we can push forward. Another big thing is, and that is the biggest thing, is energy, where we are working on the community choice aggregation. That means that we are permitted bidding against LIPA to buy electricity on the open market, and therefore give everyone hopefully cleaner cleaner energy and lower cost energy. But that is a big, big political fight if you talk politics.
Gotcha. And Welker, we had an email exchange, and I thought you said something that was important to get out there. So let me just read what you had sent me. Every decision we make on our own properties regarding the use of pesticides, fertilizers, irrigation, and especially in most cases our antiquated septic system runs downhill and into our surface waters, and that being a big part of the problem. So as a trustee, you're not really involved in the septics part of the battle. That's really village boards and town boards to deal with. But you deal with the fallout from that in the way it's affecting the waters. Do you have confidence now? We have money coming from the new use of the CPF that because voters approved it, we can start using money for water quality projects now. Is this sort of the dawn of an era where we may start to see the dominoes falling the other way for a change instead of constantly getting worse?
Absolutely. Thank you, Joe. I really believe that there's so much hope right now on the horizon, and that's not only coming from the funding, but it's also coming from the education and the presence of our second homeowners. This is a community. The town has approximately between 55 and 60 year-round residents, 60,000 year-round residents. At this point, due to Corona, we've actually probably quadrupled that number that have spent the year here. And that awareness has come out in a myriad of ways. Last summer, I got a letter from a child wanting to help with the piping plovers. He wanted to make his own signs because he saw people that were walking inside the piping plover fencing. So that's just one small way that we're seeing the involvement and the engagement of our second homeowners. And I think that awareness rising to the surface, little trustee humor there, in addition to the money that's now coming and the science that's backing it up, and also the political will on so many different fronts, I think that's really going to make a big change for us.
It's really nice to have a forum where we're talking about positive things for a change, because our environmental forums for years were always about hand-wringing and, you know, here are all the problems and here are all the things we're not doing. It's great to see this. So Jesse, let's talk about Lake Agawam and the project that you're tackling there, and that's with the Lake Agawam Conservancy, correct? The village is working with the Conservancy. Can you talk a little bit about that? We had a nice story about it a couple of weeks ago, but you're really optimistic this is going to make a difference on the lake, right?
That's right, and thank you, Joe. So that is one portion of our DEC plan. So before the pandemic, we got together with the town trustees, with the DEC, with Dr. Gobler, and with many community members, and we adopted Long Island's first ever DEC-sponsored harmful algae bloom plan. So this was part of the short-term solution. We also have medium and long-term solutions, which we'll also get to. But right now, on Lake Agawam, we have two things going on. The first thing we have is a microsonic device. We have 3 of them, and they shoot ultrasonic waves into the lake, and they push these toxic algae downward so they can't get sunlight. And that is going to be coupled with a coating of hydrogen peroxide, which is H2O2, and breaks down into water. We realized through, we talked to Dr. Gobler, and he could expand more on this, but the harmful algae blooms after the hydrogen peroxide were reduced by 50% just overnight. Now again, that is a short-term solution. The long-term solution, as Dr. Gobler pointed out, is to reduce the nitrogen and phosphorus inputs. And one thing that we're very proud of, we're talking about solutions via legislative and executive action, is that we asked our board to put aside a $3.7 million cash surplus for clean water infrastructure projects. And that's going to be a down payment on our sewer system, which will, once enacted, will really help reduce the nitrogen inputs. And the other good news is that at our upcoming board meeting, hint, hint, Joe, for a good article, we are going to be selecting an engineer to complete our map and plan and to form the legal formation of our sewer district, and this will happen within 9 months. So for the first time in our village, I believe that we are really moving in the right direction. West Hampton had used part of our sewer plan, and 5 to 6 years later, they finally broke ground. So this is not going to happen overnight, but we are moving in the right direction, and we're going to follow now in the footsteps of West Hampton. there's also a number of other projects we're working on. So for example, we tapped into the CPF Water Quality Fund, and we received grant funding for a phase 2 study of a permeable reactive barrier. That's a fancy name for wood chips where they go right into the ground and they block the polluted aquifer from getting into the water. So thank you to the CPF fund for that. And then also to address some of the dangerous herbicides and pesticides that are getting into the lake, we also tapped into the CPF Water Quality Fund, and we'll be using money from that and from the county to build a bioswale this summer on the east side of Old Town Pond. And thanks to help from the Lake Agawam Conservancy, we have a few members here. They had paid for the installation of a bioswale on the south side of Lake Agawam. Again, these bioswales use natural species or native species of plants in order to recharge the groundwater and to prevent some of the toxic road runoff from getting in. So those are just a handful of projects we've done. There's been a lot more. We also applied for an $800,000 grant from the CPF Water Quality Fund for Old Town, and we are working with a company called Rue Engineers to build a constructed wetlands or natural treatment center on village-owned property on the north side of Old Town. So we're attacking both Old Town and Lake Agawam, and this will actually also use native species of plants to address some of the polluted aquifer. So between the sewer, between the constructed wetlands, between the bioswales, and we are well on our way. And again, I also just wanted to recognize we have two trustees here, Trustee Joe McLaughlin and Trustee Andrew Polaro, and thank you because they were able to vote on this $3.7 million Clean Water Infrastructure Fund that we set up.
So that's a lot going on. And Chris, let's stay focused on Lake Agawam for a second. I'm a layman. I've watched the lake deteriorate in 10 years. It seems to have accelerated exponentially over a couple of years. It just got worse overnight and then just continued to get worse. These various efforts, the floating devices that the mayor talked about, the bioswales versus the sewage system that is coming, what's going to actually fix the problem? So I guess what I'm asking is, what's a positive outcome from the floating devices? Will that solve the problem, or will it get you to a point? Is anything going to solve this other than a sewer system?
Great question. And I think actually Jesse very wisely summed it up in that, there's short-term and medium-term and long-term solutions. So something like the sonic devices and the hydrogen peroxide for this year is really meant to try to protect public health today. Recognizing that, and I'll just take a moment to say, the reason we're doing this is that the lake has toxic cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, that make toxins known as microcystin. When microcystin was first identified in the middle of the 20th century, the scientists called it fast death factor. It has carcinogenic properties, so it's a real threat. And so the idea of the short-term things is to protect public health in the short term. And like we said, so far it looks like the hydrogen peroxide has been very successful.
And as I recall, I remember us writing at one point that the algae that was dangerous, the blue-green algae, actually can get airborne and to some degree have an effect in a wider area. You don't have to just go in the lake to be affected by that, correct?
That's right. And frankly, I'll just be honest, the science is not is in its nascent phases on understanding the aerosolization of it, but that's a factor. As a caveat, I'll just say how the dose of something like that compares to being in the lake and accidentally swallowing the water. Sure. We don't know yet. But on the longer term front, you're 100% right. Dealing with the massive flows of sewage from the village, but also importantly recognize that the watershed of Lake Agawam goes all the way up to past Sunrise Highway even. So it's addressing the downtown area, but also the septic systems across the area. And I'll throw in one other thing that I think that is often overlooked, but I think maybe the most important element of this, and that is the sediments at the bottom of the lake. That lake was formed by a glacier 10,000 years ago. And so 10,000 years ago, the bottom of that lake looked just like the ocean sands, clean and pristine. For thousands of years, that lake has been filling in with everything, the algae, leaves, lawn, and there's a mud layer that's built up in there that's could be 6 feet or deeper. And it's a reservoir for a lot of nutrients. So the sediment, those sediments hold the history of the village, literally. And so, a final piece of the puzzle that is critical is getting those sediments out, and that's very complex and tricky. But it's a goal that we can't ignore, and it's actually, if you go to that management plan, it's A1. So I think it's very important.
And Mayor, when we talk about getting the sediments out of the lake, what you do with those sediments after that is kind of a problem then too, correct? That becomes a challenge.
That's right. It is challenging. And we have a gentleman here, Peter Campbell, who's got a technology that can potentially de-water the sediments if they are removed to take up less space. The other good news is that quietly during the pandemic, we were also working on a dredging study to get a sediment analysis, because as Dr. Gobler pointed out, the sediment at the bottom of the lake is the #1 source of phosphorus, whereas the septic is the #1 source of nitrogen. So we actually have a study that will be completed and then sent to the DEC for approval, and this will be ready to go. So after this is completed, we're 3 to 5 months out, we can actually start dredging. So dredging will be a realistic possibility, not just in Lake Agawam, but in Old Town Pond, because we have RU engineers also completing a sediment study, and they're going to be done shortly, results going to the DEC. And we have an excellent relationship with the DEC that we've built up over the last 2 years. So we are actually in prime position right now to begin dredging, probably in 2022 if we choose to do so, for Agawam and Old Town Pond. But again, you bring up a good point. Where do you put those sediments? That's kind of controversial, but at least we're going to explore some new technologies with Mr. Campbell here to see if we can dewater them on site, for example.
Which will make it a little easier to dispose of them.
Exactly.
Yeah. And let me ask you this. How closely are the town trustees watching all of these projects and their effectiveness? And how much can what we find out here through Dr. Gobler and through these projects, how much can they be transferred up to the town level and used on the bays and some of the other water bodies that you're responsible for?
As you're hearing here today, there are many different projects working in many different water bodies, and we're watching very closely to see what's effective and what's replicable and what's scalable on many different levels. Like with Lake Agawam, with the DEC coming in with everything that they bring, it's so exciting. The trustees are working in Mill Pond with floating wetlands, which are basically a mat with plants in it, and it's very simple, but the plant's roots are in the water and they absorb the nutrients, both the nitrogen and the phosphorus. They're harvested in the fall and then replanted. And also you can weigh the biomass and calculate how much nitrogen and phosphorus are removed. So that's yet another technique that we're investigating. So it's so great to be able to have these wonderful resources, to be able to see and compare, because we have so many lakes and ponds. I think there are 90 in the town of Southampton that all need help, in addition to our marine waters as well.
And it's about momentum, isn't it? When you start to do these projects and people see successes, it gets easier to pitch them going forward. We could spend the entire time talking about water. I think that's probably a topic all its own. But Dieter, I want to turn to a second to something you mentioned, and that's gas-powered leaf blowers. And your committee has been very involved in trying to get measures passed, and you've had success doing that. Can you give us sort of a rundown now? Southampton and East Hampton, I think, have new laws in place banning their use, and there are some other places that are considering them, right?
Wrong.
I'm wrong. Okay. This is why you're here.
This is why I'm here, and hopefully, therefore, getting every one of you involved in the end. What it is that Southampton Village 2 years ago started with the law of banning the use of gas leaf blowers in the time between Memorial and Labor Day. So you couldn't use them at all. So a total ban. This didn't work, but that is the key thing for tourism and people out in the outdoors. Then we wanted the same thing. By the way, I was just getting a little hint from that part. It was 3 years ago that the village did that. We went immediately, wanted to do the same thing, and we are still fighting for it. We still haven't gotten there yet. We have the law written, everything is fine. it's been postponed, postponed, postponed. So therefore, no, we don't have it yet. East Hampton has now adopted it, and this year they're starting with the same thing. And I sent information to Quark, and they're considering it too. So I'm hoping that we get that on the public hearing process within the next 4 to 6 weeks. But I was told we have to do the balloons first. We had a first public hearing, and there's a second public hearing, and all of you listen, please, second public hearing, June 8. And we need all of you to write to the town board of Southampton, we don't want these balloons. That's very important, and whoever has extra time to please sign up to speak at the hearing to get the convincing information. We don't want it. For a survey came back from the town, which was done to all the citizens, 86% of all people said, stop the balloons. It still hasn't convinced the town board yet. I don't know why, but I think there's still there's one company which sells balloon a lot. We can't do this to the small individual owner of the shop. Yes, I understand that. There's a hardship somewhere always involved with that. But we used to have balloons which we blew up with our own breath. And they float for a while, and then they get soft and fall down. So why not go back to those days? It's a step forward, not backwards. So please, help.
So the balloon bans first. Talk about the leaf blower ban and why that's an environmental issue and not just a noise issue. Because for so many people, it's a noise issue, but there's much more involved than just the noise.
Well, the key is actually not the noise. The key is health related. And health means these gas leaf blowers, when you walk along, they throw up particles, which are really dangerous if you inhale these particles. That is one of the key points of it. The noise, your eardrums bust. And the combustion engines, two-stroke engines, have these fumes coming out. They are worse than the cars. So there's this famous statistic that what one leaf blower uses can get one car from here to Tacoma, and it's the same pollution. So these units are really bad for the environment all around. And when you blow around it, you're hurting not only the plants, you're hitting the insects, bird life, you're destroying everything around you. So just for the heck of a few leaves and for a few blades of grass. We do have rakes, so there's no reason to always blow these things. I understand that in autumn when the leaves come down, that you need machines. And now the new technology doesn't need gas leaf blowers anymore. They used to be the stronger engines. The new electric engines are good enough to do the same job. And therefore, the transition starts. And there are some companies here, they have already started to convert. The argument of education, which the town board, of course, always brings up, is we don't need to educate anymore. All these landscapers, which we are using here, have been in the village, have been in East Hampton, have been all around. They know what's coming for them. So there's nothing new when we do this. They say, yeah, okay, fine, we're doing it everywhere else except Southampton town. So there should not be a problem to get this law through.
And also, it's really up to homeowners to make that change, right? Because the contractors are going to do what homeowners tell them, and if the contractors are told, mulch those leaves and leave them on. That's what our gardening columnist always recommends. Don't blow the leaves off your lawn. Mulch them into your lawn and leave them there for the winter. It's good for the lawn to do that. If you had a push by homeowners, you wouldn't really need legislation, right? Because that would sort of take care of itself.
Joe, this is the key point you're touching here. If we look at environmental pollution in the largest sense, the biggest pollutions everywhere are homeowners. Our homes are the pits for environmental problems. All the pollution we are doing there. And if we individually do the right thing, and in the case of gas leaf blowers, tell your landscapers, don't do it. Don't use them. I don't want them. Or the same way with the pesticides. We don't want pesticides. The moment they say that, the landscapers say, yes, sir, and don't do it, for that's where the money comes from. So there's absolutely no reason why this cannot get through.
I'd like to see us start to embrace brown lawns as something you're actually showing civic pride, that I'm taking some responsibility. I'm not requiring my lawn to be perfect.
But what you may not know is that when the landscaper comes in and pesticides all the lawn, they put little signs out, you know, the famous circle. Inside is a little child and a dog and a red circle. That means don't let your children and dogs get out there for the next 8 hours. I mean, doesn't that prove, yes, we have pesticides, your lawn, you can't do it, so you shouldn't go there. I mean, how much more obvious can that be?
That all runs into the lakes and ponds and down into the
Absolutely.
groundwater, and you're the expert here. You tell them. That's what happens, right? I mean, that's the root of the issue here. It's about poisons going into the ground, onto the ground, and ending up in our water supply.
Yeah, and the biggest issue there is, remember that our groundwater is our drinking water, and no one's drinking water comes from further away than 2 miles from their home. And so, you know, even if you have whatever no one has city water. That you might have Suffolk County Water Authority water, but that wellhead is only a mile, at most a mile or two from your home. And so, you know, literally, therefore, these sorts of applications, you're literally poisoning the well, which is, you know, probably the even bigger issue. You know, as opposed to by the time it gets to the surface waters, you know, you don't want to be drinking these things if you can't play in them for 8 hours.
Absolutely. So Dieter had mentioned vehicles and vehicle pollution, vehicles providing a big part of this equation. So let's talk a little bit about that. Mayor, is there something on the table now to move towards more green applications when it comes to vehicles? Electric vehicles seem to be gaining some momentum. Again, that word. It seems like the use of electric vehicles is starting to pick up. There's going to need to be infrastructure in place to further encourage that. It's sort of that tipping point that has to happen. What's the village looking? Is the village looking at doing anything more with electric vehicles?
We definitely are, and we recently had on our agenda the adoption of electric charging stations. So we actually worked with a company that does a revenue share, and so we'll have electric charging stations installed both behind Village Hall, by Agawam Park, and at a third location. So we're getting the ball rolling through electric charging stations. Now, personally, I would like to see the village purchase either hybrid or electric vehicles moving forward for our village-owned vehicles. That has been a struggle. There are there have been some department heads that don't want them, and so it's a little bit of a back and forth. I use the example of Sag Harbor. They recently purchased hybrid vehicles for some of their police vehicles. So Sag Harbor is taking the lead there. We would like to follow in their example, but we can start with the electric charging stations and pushing our board and our department heads to move forward. Now, there are probably some times where you can't have one, but they're critical. And then also wanted to point out we have Dorothy Riley here from Drawdown, and on our next meeting, thanks to her help, we'll be declaring a climate emergency in the village of Southampton, taking the lead from East Hampton and setting up a Drawdown committee where that committee will help us put in place various activities we can do to reduce our carbon emissions, with hopefully electric vehicles and hybrids being one of them.
Can you talk a little bit about what a municipality has to do to put in charging stations? Like, I'm not sure of the mechanism of that. If you wanted to put in charging stations in the municipal lot behind us, what's involved in that? Do you have to have private companies involved? Does the village have to pay for the entire infrastructure? How does that work?
We actually just contracted this out to a private company. We thought that was the easiest way to do it. And then we set up a revenue sharing agreement. I don't know what other municipalities do, but we felt that this was the easiest. This way we just outsource it, and it's really no hardship to the village at all. And we also, it could actually be profitable because we can get part of a revenue share.
How soon do you think that could happen?
A few months.
Is it a matter of months rather than
A few
years?
months, yes.
Okay. Good to know. And I want to ask you about the SOAR program. You had mentioned this to me, which focuses on the marine environment and on aquaculture in particular, I'm assuming as part of a way to help clean the marine environment as well. Can you talk a little bit about what the SOAR program is?
Chris, you may want to chime in on this because it was actually you that introduced this concept to us. We got an email from Dr. Gobler back in the late fall that the Pew Charitable Trust, the Nature Conservancy, NOAA, and the Agriculture Department were all collaborating because they saw a tremendous need. 90% of oysters are consumed in restaurants, and with the challenges of COVID, restaurants obviously had either closed or not been serving oysters. So many, all commercial aquaculturists were greatly impacted by this. And thank goodness for some really just creative, out-of-the-box thinking. Most oysters are enjoyed at about a 3-inch on the half shell, and because the oyster growers weren't able to sell, the oysters got much bigger and they got craggly and ugly, and people won't buy them or eat them. And what to do with these oysters? So money and creative thinking put together this program that the large oysters are purchased from commercial aquaculture growers in 7 different states, 6 on the East Coast and the state of Washington, and transported to create or reinforce oyster reefs in those states. And oyster reefs are extremely beneficial to the environment. Chris can build on this, but one oyster can filter up to approximately 50 gallons of water a day. So the environmental benefits for water quality are huge. Also, the crags and so forth in oyster reefs create a great deal of habitat for other creatures, crustaceans and shellfish, and some finfish as well. So we were lucky enough that Dr. Gobler was part of this discussion, and he came to the trustees and asked if we would be part of helping to purchase some of these larger oysters from the commercial growers and put some into Shinnecock Bay. What did I miss, Chris?
No, you hit the nail right on the head. And so, we've got now 6 oyster reefs in western Shinnecock Bay. We started them several years ago, and all the SOAR oysters went out there. Most of the oysters we have in those reefs are actually what we call spat on shell, so the oysters are actually growing on prior oyster shell. But the oyster reefs out there are what we call recruitment limited. We don't have enough oysters to make a self-sustaining population yet. So this will make a huge difference in having more adult oysters. So when we have the spawn this year, there's a greater likelihood of them being able to reproduce and create an indigenous population, which would have been a fairy tale just a few years ago.
I've always been fascinated by the fact that this shellfishing industry has to be unique in that its product actually leaves the water cleaner than when they started. Dieter?
I'd like to add another little point, which we were all involved in, and the key word here is kelp. The shellfish people have the opportunity now to grow kelp, and kelp is one of the key plants to clean water, for it absorbs CO2. It is harvested before the boating season starts. It provides food, it provides product for the chemical industry, for the beauty industry, and it is sort of an all win-win situation where those shellfish fishermen have an additional income, cleaning the water, using it as fertilizer, or for our own production and food. So I like to put that in. This is now, we are in the middle of the final legislative actions in the Assembly and in the Senate in Albany. And our Senator Kaminsky and Assemblyman Thiel have been pushing this. So we are waiting now here is it getting through or not? This could be next week. So that is a very important part to clean up our waters and agriculture and additional income, etc.
Is there anything we can do to help at this point, or is it far enough along?
It's gone. It sits in the government. Thank you.
I think people can still write letters. Assemblyman Thiel asked me this week to write a letter. So
still?
I
Okay.
think there's still room for that.
Okay,
Never
thank
hurts
you.
to speak up, but it's true, isn't it? That's an industry that within all of these ways, it's the rare industry that leaves things better when it's healthy, and it hasn't been healthy for
It's
a
a
while.
win-win.
Yeah.
Absolutely for everybody.
And the term that can be used there is sustainable aquaculture, and that's right. So literally, if you have an aquaculture farm, and you've got oysters and kelp, they don't need anything to grow but the water, and as they grow, they have to be taking nitrogen out of the water, and the kelp have to be taking carbon dioxide out of the water, which helps bring it out of the atmosphere. So each of these, therefore, oyster farms is literally, doing the work that we need, cleaning the water. And I'll just emphasize that we started out talking about upgrading these septic systems, which is great. And you may remember I said, the county's got a program that goes till 2050. And then all the groundwater has to work its way out through the aquifer as well, and that takes decades. So my point being that it's very important that in parallel with all these great projects on land, that there's these in-the-water activities that are in the water today in 2021, removing the nitrogen, removing the carbon. And this is an incredible way to do that. This bill will help, and again, it's sustainable. So we've witnessed in our lifetime the collapse of the Long Island Sound lobster, the South Shore hard clam, the East End Bay scallop. In aquaculture, that such a collapse is it's not impossible, but it's highly unlikely because you're only harvesting what you're selling, and you have your own plot, you're responsible for yourself. And so this is really a great way for the future to assure that we don't, and we're therefore not extracting the wild populations that may be vulnerable to future crashes and letting those recover on their own. So it really is, I think, to borrow what I think Dieter said before, a win-win, and you can tack on a bunch of wins on top of that as well.
Okay, I wanted to leave enough time for questions from the audience, if anybody has any. I don't know what the easiest way to do this is. I could come out with the microphone. Oh, you got a microphone. Joe's going to be, I don't have to be Phil Donahue running around the crowd. That's good. Anybody have any questions? Right here.
Yes, I live in Southampton, North Sea. And my question is, it seems that a lot of the harmful chemicals and gas blowers and such which come into the town of Southampton and East Hampton are actually sold in places like Home Depot and Lowe's, which are in the towns of Brookhaven and Riverhead. And my question is, on behalf of the town of Southampton, A, have we been trying to work with those towns, or what kind of potential influence can we have towards restricting the sale of those harmful chemicals and devices which are not located in our town? What kind of influence or action can we potentially take? Or has this been an area of limitation and frustration on behalf of our town?
Dieter, is that a strategy that you guys have thought of, is try to get towns to ban the sale of them to make it a little more inconvenient for people to buy them?
Yes. The point is there have been many municipalities in the United States where there is already a total ban of gas leaf blowers in effect. We are at the first step, partial ban during the summer season. The effect of what we are doing is something which I believe very strongly in, and that relates directly to your question of all the other products you talk about, is it's from the bottom up. You cannot say we total ban in New York State. Yes, look at the ban of plastic bags. We started the ban of plastic bags, got East Hampton involved, got other municipalities involved, Suffolk County started, New York City started, and now New York State started. So it's from the bottom up, a small thing. If we succeed in Southampton to make a partial ban that should lead to the full ban, whether it's pesticides or the gas leaf blowers, then neighborhoods are looking at the same thing. As you can see, what the village did with the first ban went to East Hampton, now hopefully starts with us. So it starts. The East End is now one. Suffolk County is watching. And we already have the first law in New York State with gas leaf blowers ban working. So that's how it goes. Unfortunately, what you're talking about is in Ethiopia. We cannot cancel everything at one time. It doesn't work.
I guess my point was, it seems like Brookhaven and Riverhead, I'm not targeting them specifically, but because they have Lowe's and Home Depot, which to them are considered employers and large taxpayers and whatever else potentially, how motivated are towns like that to do something as opposed to we who don't have Home Depot, and they are such huge sellers of these types of products, which we're trying to eventually put out of our
But see,
daily
if
use.
start small.
Yeah.
We have a flower shop here, a very well-known one, which has been around for decades. Look at their shelves of what they're selling in the way of fertilizer and pesticides. Here.
Yeah.
I wonder, Mayor, if you sort of had a little bit of a hint to one way to begin to address what this gentleman is saying, which is, as the villages and the towns start to declare disaster through Dorothy's organization, East End Drawdown, I think has been encouraging that, the climate disasters, then municipalities have a reason to start taking more aggressive action towards this type of a measure, and maybe it's Riverhead and Brookhaven haven't gotten there yet, but if they get to the point where they declare a climate emergency, they may have to look at measures like that as well, right? That gets them a reason to start doing that.
That's right, and we should lead by example. As you pointed out, if something happens on the most local or micro scale, generally speaking, it might work its way up to higher levels. One challenge that we do have, you may not be aware, but we looked into banning certain pesticides and herbicides. But unfortunately, a New York state law, which supersedes us, actually won't allow us to do so. But we can do other things like collect data and determine, how much pesticides or how much herbicides we're using, and then actually publicize that data just to raise awareness. But we can, as we pointed out, we could lead by example, and working with great organizations like Drawdown could really help us do that.
And it goes back again to awareness, and then the consumers making decisions and saying, we're not going to use those products, and maybe then they disappear from the shelves too. Kimberly.
A comment first. Very good job. Thank you for putting this on, SAC. Just returned from Florida, visiting my mother who lives on Lake Okeechobee, where they had a harmful algae bloom pod the size of New York City. So I think harmful algae blooms are a nationwide and worldwide problem, and I think our climate crisis is beyond that. Having said that, California just completed a study, and it indicated that gas leaf blowers and two-stroke engines drive more carbon monoxide into the air than all their cars combined in California. So they are looking to address it, to your question, from a policy standpoint at the state level. But the states on the West Coast have far advanced in this area, and we haven't, and that's something I think we need to understand better, why we cannot do that. What are the lobbyists that they have, that we have? Why are we not moving faster? And I see Dieter in action, and I've never seen anybody pound the electoral board as hard as he has, and he won't let up, so you've got a good person there, and I've seen you in action too. But I will say that in the village of Southampton, when former Mayor Irving led the way for gas leaf blowers, it was really hard for him. He had a room of landscapers with pitchforks and industry and manufacturing, and they were very angry because they felt something was being taken away. So he was able to come to the table and do that. We found a compromise. It's not perfect, but it set the groundwork. That needs to be accelerated at a higher level. But the point I'm trying to make is when we heard the scientists in Florida talking about the issues, they mentioned that the temperature rise was really the bigger issue in their view for harmful algae blooms, in addition to, all of the pesticides and the other items that you're working so hard on. So I wondered from Dr. Gobler's standpoint, who's probably mentoring these scientists down in Florida, because I know you go down there a lot, what is your view on temperature? Because then it goes right back to drawdown, and it also goes back to the New York State CERTA 10-point framework for municipalities, which address the shift to high-impact actions to obtain grant funding and also shift over to non-carbon driving communities. Long-winded.
So, Dr. Gobler, how local a problem is harmful algae? How big a problem is it throughout the country? And what role does climate change have in that?
Yeah, so I mean, harmful algal blooms are definitely a global problem. I mean, there's not a continent in the world that's immune, and it's a public health crisis, freshwater and marine. On the temperature front, I actually am continually astonished by the temperature data, our local temperature data. So I've recently been able to collaborate with some scientists to use satellites to get water temperature data. And the amazing thing about satellites is they're up there all the time. So these records are incredible. Every day since 1982 and they keep getting more specific. So now they're getting down to a square kilometer. So just recently, for example, I got the NASA data set for different points in the Peconic Estuary. And the line you can draw just from 2000 to 2020, and this is the important thing about climate change, it's not universal. So, our winters, the temperatures are not changing. Our springs, the temperatures are not changing. But our summers are getting hotter. I think it's the data shows 1.5 degrees Celsius in just 20 years, right? And then that's water temperature, and a similar change for the fall. And for me, as a scientist, the most concerning part of this is that it's in the summer. That's when we're already at our peak temperatures. And so what that means is that you're going to have more and more organisms that were at their what we'd call thermal maximum now being pushed over the edge. And it's going to rearrange everything. And that's why. So I think these sort of global initiatives are drawdown so important. But I also interpret this as we must double down on the things we can do locally, like the farming of seaweeds to remove CO2 and to create a halo around those oysters to protect them. We haven't used the words ocean acidification yet, but that's a consequence of too much CO2. You can actually reverse that with these seaweeds. And reducing the nitrogen. I know that they're not directly related, but you make our ecosystems more resilient by having that, it's one less stressor on them. If we have to accept that there's going to continue to be more CO2 and more temperature increase, we must, that's an action call. We must control the things that we can control immediately, because the train has left the station on climate change. We must do things locally on that front, but there's no doubt that we already know if we shut off the spigot of CO2 today, the levels keep going up. In fact, last thing I'll say on this, I also am always checking the global levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. We just hit a record this week we've never had before, 420 parts per million. And I'm a scientist. I'm always trying to do experiments that compare today to the future. And I felt like it was 2 years ago we were at 410. And anyway, the rates everything's accelerating. And so climate change is huge. We must account for it, and it must be the thing that motivates us to, again, address the things that we can address immediately.
Okay. Dorothy.
SAC, thank you very much for this amazing program, Tom and Daniela, and for the amazing panelists, and Joe, for you moderating. It's really terrific to have this in our own backyard. I love it. I think it's brilliant that the village right now is considering the climate emergency declaration. Thank you very much, Jesse and Joe and Andrew. They're doing it at a time when they're about to start a master plan. And that would allow the overarching concerns here to filter through everything that they're doing, which it could could be extraordinarily powerful. So just a little aside, Chris, when you said drawdown, but we need to do things locally, I'd just like to remind you that there's so many drawdown things we can do locally. And according to the UN Environmental Program Report, 2/3 of all carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions come from decisions at the household level. So we are incredibly more powerful right here where we sit than we can imagine. But Dieter, my next thing is for you, and that is East Hampton has declared a climate emergency. Southampton Village may be, jumping in ahead of you on this. Where is the town stand, and why don't you do this so you can have that overarching lens for everything else you do, considering that this is the most important thing in the world today?
It's at the board level. I'm waiting for the signature.
Oh, great. I'm very happy to hear that. Thanks.
Dorothy's organization, again, this is Dorothy Riley, and her organization is East End Drawdown.
Almost. Drawdown East End.
Drawdown East End.
And
I've
for
written it.
those of you who are actually climate early adopters, we have another organization called Carbon Crew Project, and that's for people who want to work in teams to actually reduce their carbon footprint 50% in the next 10 years. So get in touch with me if you're interested in that.
Dorothy, I apologize. I've typed Drawdown East End so many times, you'd think it would be in my brain. Any last question? How about in the back there?
Thank you, and thank you for having this forum, everybody. This really is directed to you, Chris, more than anybody else. Without a doubt, we talked about local and individual homes. Southampton is more driven by beauty than function, without a doubt. And consequently, we see a lot of stuff being applied to lawns. We see a lot of pesticides use. And one thing that I've been growing more and more concerned about, and it's a really reflection of our freshwater system that is out here in the East End, is the use of sprinklers and irrigation. And my concern there, Chris, is that as the population increases, we're using more and more water. Our demand for water has become greater. We don't have really many gray water sources that we're using for irrigation and lawn purposes. There is, without a doubt, and I think you'll see it more in Shelter Island because it's a more remote island. As we draw down that aquifer, the temperatures are rising worldwide, our ocean waters are rising, and we're drawing down our aquifer. We're getting greater and greater salt intrusion. And I just, in a foreseeable future, if we all don't get together with a drawdown and a conservative use of our water source, I'm concerned that we're going to turn on our taps one day and we're going to get ocean water and it's going to all be salt. And I just wanted to get your comment on that.
Yeah, and that's a reality. And in fact, I know someone who lives on Mecox Bay who one day woke up and they were watering their lawn, and they noticed in 1 week it all turned yellow, and they weren't sure why. It is because, well, their private well went from being fresh water to salt water. And yeah, certainly we know as the season starts now that the demand for water is through the roof, and it certainly does threaten private wells as well as public wells, and it changes the natural flow of groundwater to the point where you may get very little recharge, if any, during the summer. And so we've seen weird things. I even know someone in East Hampton who lives on a water body that had a blue-green algae bloom, and they suddenly one day took a shower and were getting a skin rash. And the best explanation from the health department was that perhaps their well was literally drawing water in from the pond because there was no longer that water flowing through. So it is a serious issue, and I do think water reuse has to be considered. It's not considered out here. People on public water, they're probably not as threatened, or maybe not threatened. The Suffolk County Water Authority is incredibly creative in how they get water, and they will just drill deeper and deeper and deeper. But for people on private wells, it's definitely a very serious issue, and it will continue to be. And so you're on spot that we do need more probably water reuse in those sorts of regions.
Anybody have any final thoughts? Anything left to say? I think it's been a great conversation. I hope you'll join me in thanking the panel for just a wonderful conversation and a very engaged audience. Thank you for that. Thanks for coming out. Thank you to the Arts Center for putting this on. Happy to do it, and we'll see you again soon to keep talking about these issues. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.